RVCE 2, I'm closing government IITB 1, and I'm closing opposition YNC1. Alright, without further ado, let's begin the debate. Invite the Prime Minister.
One of the major perils of a globalized world is the blindness and inability of consumers to see the story of the products in which they consume. And in many instances, you're blocked away from knowing how that cloth that you're wearing and being proud of was produced in many instances. But I think people within the first world are especially hypocritical when it comes to this, that in many cases, they're actually provoked and angry about things like maltreatment of animals in many instances when we're exposed to these things. But regardless of how much exposure we get to things like sweatshops and people who are literally under child laborers working on many of these areas, they remain quiet to the modern day slavery. That means that you actually force in people to work in many of these areas. I think that is especially hypocritical and wrong in this debate. Three things we're going to be doing from OG. Firstly, we'll tell you why first world consumers should care, creating why there's a moral obligation to do so. And secondly, why the third world laborers are actually better if they do this. Secondly, we'll tell you why fast fashion actually harms fashion in itself and stops the ability for you to have innovations. And thirdly, we'll tell you what are the impacts of this boycott and why we think it's especially better on our side of the house. But just one clarification I just want to point out. Look, we don't have to be in support of you having the same base level of employment benefits or employment standards that you or labor standards that you would have within the United States or within Europe, for example. But what we think is you need a bare minimum that is actually suitable for humanity and for humans to actually live and work within those areas. We don't think what you have in status quo is in any way comparable to that. Given that on the first issue, why we think first world consumers should care. Firstly, I just want to point out that they largely have a moral obligation to do this because we ought not to see labor as a commodity. And in many instances, we often recognize this within first world countries, that within the United States, for example, you need employment benefits and you need to have some base level of working standards to ensure people don't get hurt, for example, when working in specific areas. But these are things that are not afforded to people within third world countries, that in many cases we look upon them and see it as they just have to work within these areas and it's fine for them to do so. But the reason especially why we have a moral obligation is because the people from first world countries actually carry the capital control in many of these instances. That is to say, by and large, they're the people who actually exploit these businesses and buy from these businesses. That means two things. That means firstly, they are the only people with the ability to create change in many of these areas, and the refusal to do so means that you're shifting that moral obligation and ensuring that you don't get changes in many of these areas. But secondly, you're also complicit by funding many of these things, because what you're literally doing is sending in the next dollar to H&M that validates that practice and ensures that they're able to do so, right? What we think you get on the third world laborers on our side of the house is that they are forced and stuck into a bubble, because what this means is that you only attract people who come in for exploitation. So for example, if this country is known as areas where you have your H&M, for example, or you have many of these businesses, what that means is that you attract more people to go in there, and there's a race to the bottom where it becomes about who can exploit these people as much as possible to get resources from them in status quo. That means you don't get to attract people in other areas within these countries. For example, we think that many of these countries have other areas which they are specialized in, and you can easily go in there and practice many of these things, but the sole focus on exploiting labor means that often you don't get to exploit many of those things, but simply zero down towards labor. I think you're more likely to have things like the textile industry, for example, because the modern day globalized world isn't one of trade between finished goods, but one between trade between the value chain, for example. That means that you still need to go into many of these places to get textile, for example. It's not the case that because you increase the standards, H&M is suddenly going to pull out from these countries. I think they're still going to be incentivized to go in there, especially considering we don't require the same extent of standards in this debate. But secondly, and more importantly, is that many of these industries and many of these companies actually drive away SMEs from many of these countries. That is to say, at the point in which you go in there with your heavy budget for advertising, your heavy budget and your brand name that already exists in many of those areas, you're often going to take away jobs from these SMEs. That means that the comparative is not just a world in which you have these people being jobless, but often you get SMEs that are able to take over from those corporations and ensure that people do get some jobs on our side of the house. I don't think we're simply leaving them with nothing at all in this debate. Closing.
So what's the alternative for the buyer in the first world country? What would they do instead of buying something?
Right. So here's the thing. We're willing to concede, on one hand, that you might have a marginal increase in the extent of which you're able to buy shirts, for example, or fashion in many instances. But secondly, I'm going to prove to you exactly here why that is not necessarily the case. But even if that's the case, I think it's what the slavery that you force many of these people in these third world countries to go to. I don't see why that's a comparative at all for you to fork out an extra $50, for example, right? But secondly, why we think this stifles innovation in the fashion industry? Because note that what this fast fashion does is actually taking on trendy things, and trends don't just build instantaneously like that. What happens often is that a company actually takes the risk and takes the initiative to push barriers and ensure that fashion changes. CF Kanye West, for example, where people are now in love with the Yeezys where they would never like it before. What happens is when you're able to take many of these trendy things and develop it in a way that is actually suitable for people with a lower price, is that you often affect the profits of many of those companies that start this up to begin with in status quo. That means, for example, fast fashion industries are able to use their ads because they don't have to spend as much on the research, as much on the development, as well as much on the risk of if that fashion trend should actually fail in status quo. But they're able to like leverage off people who have taken that risk, have lost money by doing so, and ensure they're able to divert that money instead into ads. That means that often you're lowering the profit margins of many of these innovative companies that are able to start up this trend in status quo. What we think you're likely to get is that you get more profits for many of these people at the point in which you don't have to compete against someone who isn't playing by the rules in status quo. And I think that's an important bit in this debate. That means you're more likely to get prices reduced by many of these innovative companies because they are no longer competing against many of these corporations. But secondly, it's not just about the big brands that exist out there, because there are also low-cost brands that are innovative in status quo. What you do on your side is you force them to compete against an H&M that isn't playing by the rules. That means I don't think it's the case that because H&M is boycotted and isn't as prominent as possible, you don't get any alternative except from your expensive fashion trends. Instead, you're likely to buy from other low-cost brands out there that are actually not doing the same thing as you get on this side of the house. That because they're able to, like, they have to still pay their tax, pay for infrastructure as a low-cost business that is starting up. What you get is a more predatory sort of pricing on your side because H&M can simply price them out of the market. But fourthly, what we think this does and the impact this creates, we think at the point in which you boycott these industries, examples like we've seen in the past where you boycott H&M, for example, and you see a marginal increase in the extent of labor standards within many of these countries because you need a PR spin to actually tell people that you do care about these workers. That means at the very least you get the short-term changes in many of these areas. We're willing to boycott these people as long as it takes for you to get a sustainable standard that means that workers aren't just treated like shit that goes on in status quo, right? That means it might not be to the same level, but you definitely don't get people being burnt up in a factory. You definitely don't get people being forced to work outrageous hours in those countries. Extremely proud to propose.
Thank you. Understand, please.
Panel, do not let government bench in this debate run away with like undermining the importance fashion plays in people's lives. We think that people derive a lot of utility out of modern day fashion, and it's important to them for specific reasons, right? We think that it allows them to express themselves, right? When I wear this kurta, Madam Speaker, I have an association with my country, right? I have confidence that it gives me to speak in the out round of a debate tournament, right? Like we think that there is specific reasons why people buy into fashion, and we think that that's why it's become such a big industry in the first place, right? Like we think that this is especially magnified in first world countries where people, or rather societal interactions that people have are often based on how well they're dressed, right? Or how well into the latest trends that they go into, right? We don't think as a house we can pass a value judgment as to saying that the needs of these people in the first world countries or the reasons why they buy into fashion are anyway less than any other moral obligation that they would have to someone else, right? Before I continue on my constructives, let's talk about sweatshops and why this isn't really that big a part of this debate, right? Like first, we think that if they're opposed to sweatshops and they say that it's exploitative, we think that every capitalist structure somewhere is exploitative to someone else, right? Like we think that if they're unhappy with some person, with like people being in lower standards, we think that they must be that they must oppose capitalism as a whole, right? Like we think that in any strive towards moving towards someone else, we think that it necessarily leads to paying another person some less amount of money, right? But on specifically sweatshops, right? Like first, we think that the situation today isn't as bad as it was maybe 20 years ago, right? Like we think that because of large scale like implosions on practices of companies such as Nike, where like sweatshops were raided and sweatshops were broken down in Bangladesh, right? We don't really see, and they give us no examples in Prime Minister or no characterization even as to why this is such a big problem or how many people are into this, right? We think that this has changed to a large extent, where even in third world countries such as Bangladesh, such as India, where outsourcing largely happens, we think that labor regulations are maintained and labor regulations are there, right? Understand, Madam Speaker, even in their worst case, we think that they haven't really engaged with the comparative as to what these people would do without these jobs, right? We think that without these jobs, they're essentially starving, right, Madam Speaker? We think that to the extent that even in the absolute worst case, where there are very less labor regulations, we think that it's still better than having them starve because of lack of food, right? It's still able to give them some amount of livelihood, some amount of ways in order to go about their lives, right? Next, they tell you about competition and why when more people come there, it becomes a race to the bottom, right? Understand, Madam Speaker, that this race to the bottom isn't going to increase and that competition is essentially good, right? Understand that when one company comes in offering slightly more to the laborers, right, people within that market would move to that other company, right? Understand, it's not going to be a race to the bottom, but necessarily a race to the top, where if workers see more benefits accruing from one specific new company that comes in, that's where competition actually strives to improve labor standards, because more workers move into the place where they believe that they can actually gain more benefits, right? Next comes this weird constructive that we get from government, that's saying that these companies aren't playing by the rules and hence their profits are not necessarily legitimate, right? Like first, we tell you that just because they're able to, these fast fashion companies are able to copy like mainstream fashion, doesn't mean that mainstream fashion loses out in any way, right? By their own characterization, if that characterization were to be bought, then people wouldn't do things like buy Rolexes, right? Simply because we can get a watch that looks similar from a side street shop for $5, right? We think that there is still a value of these super premium industries where people would still buy into them, right? We don't think that a free market has any rules for people to be played with, right? Like we think that and this is a constructive that will give you an opening opposition, that how this actually pushes for artistic endeavor in terms of like having designers to push for absolutely new things that cannot be copied or cannot be knocked off easily and still have an intrinsic value within them, right? What do we bring to you on opening opposition, right? First, we think that the way society is structured today, people have a right in order to be able to access fashion, right? Understand, Madam Speaker, that even in their best case, if everyone boycotts this and Zara is no longer a reality, right, fashion will still exist, right? We will still have the New York fashion show or your London fashion shows bringing out new trends every day, right? Understand, Madam Speaker, that before these fast fashion industries existed, there was no way for people to access this, right? People from the middle class in first world countries to access super expensive fashion, right? But there was always a fetishization for it, right? And there will always be a fetishization for that fashion. We think that what fast fashion enables people to do is that they enable people to self-actualize and actually buy into access that fashion which they always thought was so hard, but which society always fetishized, right? Why do we think that this is okay, right? We don't think that an individual consumer can be held morally culpable for what a company does, right? We think that as long as the means by which they made that money is fair, we think that it's okay for them to spend it the way they want, right? We don't really see as to why they have that moral obligation they talk about, right? I think we don't see as to how they can be held morally culpable for something that the company they're buying from does, right? We think that their reasons for buying the fashion, which is simply to lead a more trendier life or to be better accepted in society or to have a higher societal standard, is perfectly legitimate, right? Unless they give you mechanisms as to saying why it isn't, we don't see why they can be held morally culpable or why that moral obligation exists for them in that supersedes their need to like have a better role in society, right? Before I move on, closing.
Right, so if your case is sweatshops are equivalent to capitalism and economic empowerment of people who don't have any other choice is reason to not regulate this industry, Are you also finding things like child labor that are also economically important?
Again, that's under the assumption that there is absolutely no regulation, right? Through my own characterization I gave you, I think we think that regulation has improved. We think that regulation can improve through competition. We don't really see as to why this is a part of this debate, right? Like we think that regulation should be there, but we don't really see as to how boycotting them will anyway help your regulation come about, right? By boycotting them and bankrupting these companies, you're just taking away a way for these people to make money, right? We think that what fast fashion has done is it's lent added benefits to the industry, right? By increasing the amount of revenue, we've seen things like sustainable fashion come about, right? We've seen innovation in every single brand of fashion in terms of like these companies competing on such a scale to get an edge over the others. We've seen innovation coming about in several different ways, right? We think that what this essentially also does is that this pushes the barrier of artistic endeavor, Madam Speaker. We think to the extent where designers now have to be able to think of ways in which they can design such that it supersedes what these shops can do, right? The ability to integrate things that are not easily copied, right? The ability to make things that are exclusive of these people, right? We think that essentially what this does is that more competition drives more innovation, right? We think that it gives people livelihood. We don't really see as to why one individual consumer in a first world country should be held culpable for a company's fault rather than the benefits that they derive in terms of having the ability to express themselves or the ability to integrate better in society. They've given you no mechanism in this debate. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you, Elmo. Please.
I think the leader of opposition missed the point when Eric brought you the hypocritical world where we live in, where people or individuals living in the first world community don't sympathize as much to the sufferings of people within the locality that are being exploited on a daily basis with no form of safety net, and like vast majority of people within these regions like living in a state of depression or even committing suicide within those circumstances. And probably these are still people that will go vegetarians all in the name of protesting animal rights, right? So we tell you the same principle is what applied here through boycotting, because they are also the side that also want to talk about regulation, right? Because the idea of regulation already concede to the idea that the problem does exist on their world, right? But while regulation is not entirely solving any problem on the side of the houses, anytime you get like raids in sweatshops within Bangladesh, no one sees it on CNN or BBC because those publicity within those circumstances remain in this area. So we don't entirely see how that has changed everything if we live in a world where this capitalist structure are ones that lobby against the corrupt government within these areas in silencing the mouth and the grievances of these people. We don't see that how that entirely works or benefits them. Few rebuttals before I move into my extensions, right? So the first one to talk about the importance of fashion in terms of how it's important for people to be able to express themselves, right? We'll tell you that their side of the house is not one that entirely defend this ideology or the standards of fashion on their side of the house, right? Because if the ideology is fashion means a lot to people, right? Then it's also important to maintain that this fashion are maintained in the most in the most creative and the most pure form on the side of the house. They didn't entirely show us how H&M or how Zara kind of like can walk towards like these expressions on the side of the house, rather than just stealing the creative works that are being propagated by smaller corporations within the US in fashion shows and just making it cheaper for people for true exploitation for people to be able to access. But what we think will happen on our side of the house is these individuals that have worked hard in creating fashion trends, in coming out with creative inventions and stuff, are the ones that are actually profiting from the fruit of their hard labor. they deny even these people within the first world this right or capabilities on their side of the house. We don't entirely think fashion will die out on our side of the house. We think fashion is even more preserved, right? If people probably like Giuseppe Luigi in Italy can come out with its originality and like creativity and selling it from no form of exploitation, we don't see how H&M selling it for cheap makes that fashion better, because we think the originality is one to which the people that comes up with the creativity are able to sell it in the market based on their own creative measures, right? So on this idea of capitalist structures always being exploitative, we think that's probably fine, right? But in other circumstances, what we also always ensure is that people that we are profiting from are getting at least some form of safety net on the side of the house, which is why we have minimum working standards within developed countries or in other places that are not this area. The sole reason why corporations go on the side of the house is through the exploitation that they provide on this side of the house, and we think this is far way too much exploitation on our side of the house. If at bare minimum we are able to raise certain working conditions, certain working standards to ensure that people are at least profiting a bit from the efforts of their labor, we tell you that's probably sanitation, and those are the kind of exploitation probably status quo will be fine with, right? But lastly, right, on this idea of competition that self-regulating, right, we tell you that the sole reason why corporations goes in this idea is for those exploitative reasons, which is why vast majority of these corporations like go into like oligopolies, right, where they work together to make sure that prices of those regulations don't work on their side of the house, because they have all the power to do so, right? So on the moral culpability of people, we think it's important in society when we as individuals that are probably privileged or benefited from certain structures to care about people that are not as privileged from us, right? So we think the perception that exists on the side of the house is not one to which people identify the workers of sweatshop in Bangladesh as ones that have been helping them, right? We think it's one that makes it look like a dump or a wasteland, a dumping land where we can dump on all our waste on the society or use all the form of like cheap things that are able to provide us for our own benefit. We think that's a moral failure in society to which they want to defend. Before I move into my extension, yeah.
In the absence of fast fashion, the styles that people saw on runways was never accessible to them. Now they can get that from fashion through Zara. Tell me why they should be denied.
It's inaccessible because when they want to make it cheaper on your side of the house, your H&Ms are the reason why that cannot be so. Because if me as a fashion designer want to sell my brand in the most qualitative form, H&M deny me those kind of things to do so, because I can't actively compete with their labor, with this form of like prices they're able to offer in the market because of the exploitation that continue within those circumstances. So what changes here is this, right? When there is an obligation to protect this creative fashion line that we want to talk to, what we invest in is one to which you are able to make it cheaper on the side of the house without any form of exploitation. These are things like H&M makes harder, which is why when Kanye West wanted to sell his brands for cheaper rate within Nike, they are unable to do so because Nike had to point it out that the competition here in the market is H&M, which is the sole reason why all those things are inachievable on your side of the house, right? So what do we need to understand here, right? Because we'll tell you, right, like when we boycott, right, the sort of attention it brings, it's one that changes the one that already exists. The fact that you probably have, when more and more people are kind of like investing or twisting towards this direction of sympathizing, things such as social media campaigns are things this individual have access to, and these are what brings this issue into limelight of when society begin to recognize all the history of corruption or atrocities that have happened within the existing brand, right? So we tell you, they bring this issue into the fame, into the prominence of the fame, into the light of media within themselves, even through daily interaction between individuals from within these localities are one to which are vastly important because it ensures that the problem reaches the right authority in ensuring that proper sanctions are placed on these companies within those circumstances. We think these are the sort of mechanistic change you get on your side of the house. At best, all they're able to do for individuals that suffer in Bangladesh is continuous probably rape and exploitation where that no one will recognize or no one will be aware of. If we get one or two white people to talk about this problem, these are more mechanistic ways to which we bring it into the forefront of people that can actually influence changes in society. Like you can see in the animal rights movement campaigns and all sorts of things that go on within society. Society, yes, will listen to these individuals, and yes, we are able to enforce certain changes and help these individuals.
Before we proceed further into this debate, some very important analysis as to who these people really are who consume products from Zara and H&M. It's not Beyonce, it's not Cara Delevingne, it's people like you and me who go to these stores and buy clothes. And that is where this idea of like moral obligation or like accessibility comes in. We don't see why they can claim moral obligation on their side when they haven't proven exclusivity to fashion. That is the burden they have on government to prove why this is exclusive to fashion. And like also, like, people cannot care about everything and anything on their side of the in like real world. Like we don't see why this like betterment or whatever cannot be attained, or like this goodwill cannot be attained if they donate something to charity, to the less privileged or whatever. They have to tell us the exclusive benefits of boycotting, which they haven't done in 2 speeches. So like now that I've characterized who these people who buy these are, that's when the point of accessibility comes in. They talk about like purity in terms of design and how a designer is not able to sell their product in its purest form because of the existence of H&M and Zara that drive prices down and make it more accessible to these people. We have to understand that the customers or consumers of these designers are extremely rich people, and they will still exist on either side of the house who will still continue to buy designer outfits for themselves. But what happens is that these people in the middle, like me, cannot access these designers, and that's when accessibility comes in. They haven't proved to us that when I go to H&M, I'm some extremely privileged person that earned my money with unfair means, and hence I don't deserve to go and buy clothes that I want to wear and I actually like, right? So when we're talking about these people, we don't see why they have an overarching moral obligation, especially when from first speaker we've characterized the value or importance people hold while wearing clothes. Like they do hold it in like a certain value, and like we can probably say like a disproportionate value to the clothes they wear, but we're fine with that, right? Because they self-actualize through wearing these clothes. And especially when we've told you that these people are people like middle-class people who have no overarching moral obligation, we don't see why that's wrong. Closing government has the burden to do so. And now, like the main issue in this debate as to like what about those laborers and what about the people or like child laborers working in sweatshops, etc. This is where it's important to draw in a comparative. What did these people who are now employed by Nike or whatever did before they were employed into Nike? They were probably farmers. They were probably extremely low-skilled workers working in developing countries in horrible conditions, getting even lesser pay than they would have a job in Nike, right? Like they have to engage with the comparative here. It's not like they were living a beautiful life before like other corporations came in to these developing countries. But also why we tell you that this expansion of like Zara and H&M going into these developing countries and setting up shop and expanding even further is what we're okay with and we champion on our side, right? Like what happens when there are multiple companies that come in? There is this sense of competition that exists between them because they have set up shop in this country, because for them labor is an essential commodity. So they do have an incentive to maintain at least the basic standards of living, because if they don't, their laborers will probably die, and that means they have less laborers to work for them, and that is again a problem for them. And due to the nature of expansion that exists, there are multiple companies. So the competition exists in this form. Like one company might offer better conditions or whatever. So like most of the laborers will move into that company, and the other company will not have as many hands to work with. So the companies as a whole do have an incentive to maintain the basic standards of labor, basic standards that exist within laborers, because it is for their own interest. Like even if they're profit driven or whatever, they do like view labor as a valuable commodity and have an incentive. But also they've completely unresponded to like Akash's benefits about how these like expansion takes place. We do think like these corporations like go into the like upcoming trends and try to like better themselves simply because the competition exists. For example, H&M and Zara now like are moving into things like sustainable fashion, and like also this expansion causes them to drive their prices down and make it accessible to a larger portion of the public. I'll take one from closing.
Okay, so the jobs you want to protect on your side of the house that are manufacturing clothes are also prone to automation. Do you not think that things like other industries can come up in these countries at the event that fast fashion shops start pulling up?
Okay, like look at the time it takes for automation to happen, right? These people like want immediate like benefits in terms of getting a revenue to support their family and feed their children. We think that exists on our side of the house. It took like some 10 like 50 years for automation to happen. Like even if it takes that long, we think like these people can have some sort of other job, and in our worst case, even if they don't, they have some form of revenue that exists. And again, like insufficiently responded to by side opening government in terms of how it pushes artistic endeavor and how as a consumer it is beneficial to you as well. The material coming from my speech, when you see the barriers of artistic endeavor pushed. We have to understand now that because like H&M and Zara are able to adapt like exclusive designer fashion into whatever means they want, we think like these designers do hold some sort of like superiority and like hide behind this veil of superiority that their fashion is exclusive and valuable. Now that their fashion becomes accessible to a large number of people, in like with Zara and H&M coming in, that's when they're pushed to innovate and make like clothes people have never seen before. And like you as a consumer, when you see things like that, is when you're like inspired or like motivated to do better, and like you have this sense like sort of like accomplishment order. No matter how materialistic it is, you are still like inspired and you like find value in things when barriers for like human endeavor are pushed. So like this sort of like artistic endeavor or innovation they want on our side is far better and faster on our side of the house. So ultimately what opening opposition has proved to you in this debate is that their idea of labor standards or whatever does not stand. If CG is going to run with it, it's not going to work either. It makes it more accessible to the people such as like you and me who consume products from Zara and H&M. Like the market for designers is completely different, and there is still value in them because, as he said, people still buy Rolexes, etc. And like we don't see how like purity of fashion is hampered on our side. Proud to oppose.
Thank you, Arun. Member Government, please. Yes,
Ready? What opening half misses out in this debate is that the number of clothes you need is not fixed. Aggressive marketing by these companies necessitates buying too many clothes that people don't need, which then necessitates the kinds of abuses that opening government want to talk about and don't allow those local industries to improve in those regions. We're going to extend on two fronts. Firstly, on why like the incentives of these companies, what they are presently and why they necessarily change from our side. And secondly, on why sweatshops are actually bad and don't allow development of local industries in these regions, going much beyond opening government. Firstly, on incentives of companies. Why do companies go to Bangladesh in the first place, right? They have to take significant transportation costs and set up distribution networks to go all the way to Bangladesh and get clothes back. The only reason they have to go to Bangladesh is the amount of volume they can produce. We think they have a huge incentive to like, and the incentive to have sweatshops is because of the fact that the number of clothes you're creating is so large that the low labor cost accounts for that. How do they then generate demand to
to cater to this large volume? They do a few things. One, they aggressively market by saying things like, oh, blue is the new gray, pink is the new red, or whatever, right? And secondly, they have sales every season. So you have like a January sale, a February sale, a March sale, like you have an autumn sale, whatever. All of this means that like you have aggressive marketing where people are told that unless you change your fashion choices, you're missing out on something. This means a few things. One, there's some degree of like fear of missing out for people where they think that they need to buy the new color that's in or the new design that's in to be relevant in their social circles, or to be the people who see I wore some new outfit today compared to what I wore the previous day. But secondly, because of the fact that it's such a large volume business, that it's so cheap that it doesn't matter to people at the point at which they're buying. So when they go to the shop, to Primark or H&M, they see like a piece of clothing that's relatively cheap and they don't really think about how many times they're going to wear it, because they can just buy it and then later decide whether or not they want to wear it in the first place. What does all of this mean? It means that people buy more clothes than they actually need, and these are clothes they don't end up wearing more than once or twice anyway. That's the kind of culture these corporations incentivize, right? They incentivize a culture where people don't buy one piece of clothing that they wear 8 or 9 times, but they buy pieces of clothing that they wear a few times and wear out. Moreover, the quality that the product that these people generally push for are products that don't last for long times anyway. This answers closing opposition's point to opening government. What is the alternative for the buyer, right? The alternative for the buyer is buying fewer clothes and buying clothes that last longer. Moreover, this also answers opening opposition's point about, oh, you and me are the people who don't have other options. These buyers have an option to buy less. What happens now, and what changes when people buy less? One, that there's a longer inventory that these companies have, which means that they have stocks kept in their stores for longer. This means that they can't aggressively market their products in the way they used to. They can't continue to change their fashion style because of the fact that these things are kept in their locker and they have to sell them first before they can buy something else. This also means that mass production is not possible anymore. It means that they cannot rely on sweatshops to get the profit that they got earlier, because they can't produce the volume that you are producing in the past. That means that closing government is a team that's showing that sweatshops necessarily go down in this debate and analysis that opening government missed. Note that opposition can't come here and argue that just buy fewer clothes because they want these sweatshops to exist and they want more buying of clothes, and opening opposition wanted more people to have fashion. But secondly, we think that if you boycott, the benefits are larger than just buying one cloth less, because the pressure on these companies is more. What changes in our world in these local industries? Before that, I like closing's extension.
So presumably, if that is true, then these people will be even more peer pressured and will be considered having less social capital if marketing made these clothes so important in the first place.
Yeah, so they would be considered socially less important, but if the point of it is marketing incentive goes down, everybody will be buying fewer clothes, and it's more comfortable to be wearing the same clothes you wore the last month. That's fine. What happens and why are sweatshops necessarily bad? The question here is, do companies leave these industries? Opening government doesn't give us a clear answer on this. We think, firstly, not all companies are likely to leave because distribution networks are already set up and labor is still relatively cheap, so that's fine. But even if companies leave Bangladesh and India and Taiwan, we think that's good. Why? Firstly, because the jobs that government wanted to defend aren't jobs that are really something that's worth defending in this debate anyway. Why? Because there's no skilling involved in these jobs. You don't teach any people long-term skills. That means they can't be replaced. Secondly, these jobs are extremely prone to automation. So sure, in the short run, you're protecting these jobs, but in the long run, people are going to lose these jobs anyway. Thirdly, the benefit of these jobs is not too high, right? In the point of which the only benefit the opening opposition wanted to speak about was people getting some food. That's not a huge benefit of keeping these jobs in these countries. But what is the trade-off then in terms of these jobs? One, that these countries, local countries, have no incentive to either regulate or diversify these economies as long as these sweatshops exist. What happens now, right? Firstly, we think at the point of it, sweatshops start pulling out, there's much more pressure to redistribute inside these countries. It's not true that everybody inside these countries don't have a lot of money. In fact, countries where sweatshops exist have huge income inequality, right? They have some of the largest income inequality in the world. So firstly, you can have more redistribution inside these countries to protect these workers who lose their jobs. Secondly, it's more likely that local industries are set up, industries in services and agriculture and manufacturing, where people, one, have more of an incentive to skill their workers, so these jobs are more sustainable in the long run. But secondly, local industries mean that profits are retained and profits stay inside the country, which means the tax base increases. So it's better off for people who are worse in this debate. To sit down. Opening opposition says that, oh, but you can still regulate through competition. I think this regulation to competition doesn't happen because the power of these workers to ask for change is significantly lower. The reason regulation actually doesn't happen when sweatshops exist is, one, politicians have an opt-out when they say at least we signed this new deal with Primark and got some jobs. But secondly, you don't have enough pressure from people, local people, at the point at which governments can sign deals with Primark to say that they at least provide jobs. Right? Regulation doesn't work as long as there are foreign companies coming in. At the point at which you're more reliant on local industries, when you're more able to regulate, because you can regulate local industries without the fear that they'll leave, compared to regulating Primark that can go from Bangladesh to Taiwan, right? Which means that the incentive of Bangladesh to regulate H&M is significantly larger. A world where you have local industries set up and a more incentive to provide benefits to those local industries provides better long-term prospects for people in those countries, and you're better able to regulate these industries. All of this means that we are the team that showed you a boycott would lead to reducing sweatshops, and that's necessarily a benefit for industries that are more sustainable in the long run. We're proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Member of Government, Member of Opposition.
Closing opposition is going to bite the bullet and says, yes, exploitation happens and it's bad and it's unfair for the workers in third world countries. But when in this motion, which has been missing in the entire opening debate, you insert the individual, we argue that the case suddenly becomes less unfair and that you actually have to prove why your self-actualization necessarily warrants a moral obligation. I think that is the debate. Before I move on to the case, why this is not only unfair, but also why you as an individual in a first world country have a legitimate reason to prioritize your self-actualization over this moral obligation that can only create feel-good feelings and even harms you. But even if you care about all of the harms that government talks about, this is still a worse policy for everyone, including all the marginalized workers, etc. in third world countries. But before I move on to my case, several rebuttals to closing opposition. The rest will be integrated in my case. First, they say this is bad because these companies create advertising and marketing that is predatory and makes people buy and like more clothes, etc. So you're saying basically that I, as a customer, have a moral responsibility simply because I live in a status quo that's already judges me so much on my fashion choices beyond my control that probably if I opt into this moral obligation, everyone else is still going to think I'm less cool for not opting into these trends, right? The trend is not going to disappear because of that. You probably also trigger even more aggressive marketing if that is what you care about, because these companies now have the legitimate fear that you're going to lose several people, several customer bases who usually buy your clothes regardless of your marketing because you've established the brand names. So actually it's worse on your case, and you haven't actually proven why I still have that moral obligation because of a trend that I cannot actually control. Second of all, they talk about, okay, jobs. Jobs will disappear and that automation will take place, whatever in these third world countries. This whole argument is predicated on the assumption that sweatshops will disappear. We argue they won't. What happens in this policy, in fact, is companies will opt into even more exploitative policies, which I'll explain in my case, and even more cheaper alternatives because they already lose out on the current methods that they're employing, right? Companies have more options than simply closing sweatshops or continuing with them. Companies will, in fact, be worse in their policies on your case. So the whole government bench, especially closing government, hasn't actually proven why such obligation exists. No, thank you. And this is precisely what closing opposition is going to talk about. First case, why this unfairly damages customers, but we are the first to talk about who these customers are and why the self-actualization of me, depending on these brands, is more important than the kind of moral obligation that they talk about. let's recharacterize who these people are. They're not all rich jet setters who can afford Chanel but buy Zara anyway, right? It's convenient because they're convenient and like homogeneously vegetarians. This majority of people are middle-class students who are educated and caring to a certain degree, who go to networking events, who go to college or undergrad interviews and cannot afford to work to buy workout wear or to wear something for these events, right? It's unfair, not because of the value of fashion per se that opening opposition talks about, that it gives me more self-worth, but also because you are forcing me to opt into alternative that is so unfair to me, because it's either I opt into less or subpar quality clothing that is cheaper on the market, and I cannot, no thank you, compete with the rest of the society, right, in my social circles, but you also force me to actually spend so much, assuming that the characterization is true, that I care about fashion, that my current income is focused on the high-end brands that I otherwise cannot afford. So this has been forgotten in the debate, right, that you actually make them force into these options. This is why your self-actualization of you securing that networking event, of you being judged more in society, of you securing your social capital in society, we think those are important things and are legitimate for you as an individual, as the I in this debate to secure, as opposed to making you feel good about boycotting a brand, right? So we think the moral responsibility can be less important than your self-actualization, especially when you characterize emotions. Before I move on to why, even if we care, this is still worse. Yes.
Right. Your case is contingent on the idea that other low-cost brands don't exist. Why should appearing luxurious and fashionable be more important than the modern-day slavery of below minimum wage and exploitative working hours?
Actually, this is my whole case, that actually the nameless, more cheaper brands are even going to take up the space that is void now, and why that is a worse scenario. So my second case is on how this worsened companies' policies and how's the progress already made in status quo about all the problems they mentioned, and why, bearing in mind OG's own characterization that first world customers are the best agents to create change, why this is worse for everyone. Scenario A. The fast fashion industry in first world countries will then lower their prices because now they're losing a customer base that exists, right? What will they opt in for? They will opt in to even more aggressive marketing at lower prices that targets, I argue, a more vulnerable population that otherwise cannot afford to care about sustainability because they don't have the time and means, who actually can only afford cheaper clothing, right? So you actually make it worse in terms of that. But second, exactly in response to their POI, brandless, cheap alternatives to H&M and Zara will take place. And why this is bad? Because currently, the fast fashion industry still depends on their brands, which means there is visibility, which means that it's actually easier for these customers, which we argue actually care to a certain degree, to call out company policies that are problematic. That's why American Apparel was called out so bad in the media by their own customers about the kind of sexual exploitation they have on their models. And therefore, the owner apologized. This is why H&M started a sustainability campaign, because they know that to a degree, their customers care. When you take up these brandless, small, cheaper brands that are not visible, but also have more insidious practices, right? Because these are the brands that we, God knows what, are doing in third world countries. We can't even name the brands. We don't know who they are. We just know they're cheap and people will opt into that. And that's bad in general. Third, and the last point, is that you lose out on the virtue of existing in first world countries and opening shops there. Why? Because now these companies will open more shops and create more aggressive marketing in third world countries, because that's the customer base now that's more profitable. You lose out on the first world customers, because currently you can still depend on the kind of price that you can afford in these countries. Bearing their characterization that first world customers are actually the ones who are best in attempting to change the status quo, calling out these customers, demanding CSR, only first world countries actually have better regulations in general. So even if these companies have to make decisions to exist, it's still better for them to remain in first world countries as opposed to channeling their resources into third world countries where regulations are less strict about the environmental exploitation, etc. Right? So in this case, it's a comparison. What will these companies opt in? And we think that as a replacement for that, they will opt into even more exploitative practices. We are very proud to oppose it.
questions I want to look at in this speech. Firstly, what the obligation of this individual should be and whether this is a choice we should be making, and what your right to fashion and how your right to fashion weighs up with the impacts that that right has. And secondly, on regulation and sweatshops and why there's a demand for that, something we got you in extension, and how it's likely to change these countries, completely unopposed by that side of the house. But I'll deal with whatever we get. So first question then, what is the calculus of this individual, and do we actually have this right to fashion? This comes out from both government benches, right? We said a few things on this. Closing opposition tells us that it unfairly affects customers because you have less social capital in your friend circles, right? Like, firstly, off the bat, we don't think this was ever analyzed. Like, what does the social capital look like? Why is this even so important to individuals? Secondly, like, if your friends are going to judge you based on the clothes you wear, I think you need better friends. Like, it's unclear why that was so important in this debate. But thirdly, we think this harm is incredibly vague and tenuous, right? Like, your social capital going down because somehow now you have less clothes to wear versus the actual harm you're causing to individuals in these sweatshops. And that's what we got you in extension. So the point here is, firstly, not what OG said, that you are making these countries worse, but what we got you in extension, and that is you don't need so many clothes. So let's move into what we get you on aggressive marketing and how this actually works. No, Sid, we give you 2 key points in extension for why these companies go to sweatshops to begin with. We say, firstly, you base your business model on high demand and high turnover, right? So you have clothes that are cheap, clothes that need to be replaced every 6 months, every time the next sale comes about. And you need to aggressively market them to these people because you create that demand to begin with, right? So it's unclear why this is some inherent demand for fashion or some inherent demand for so many clothes, given that it's often constructed. Everyone sit in this debate. What did closing opposition told us? Closing opposition told us that now you're going to have more aggressive marketing because you have fewer clothes. But the point is, you still have fewer clothes to market, right? Current tells you that you have like more inventory build up at the point at which you aren't selling so many clothes. So even at the point at which it's a 10% boycott or a 20% boycott, that's still a massive hit to your sales, right? It means you still have those clothes left over and you can't keep aggressively marketing the same clothes that you have. And that's incredibly important. Say, what did opening opposition tell us? Opening opposition on this told us that fashion is incredibly important to people, essentially the same thing that CEO told us, right? The key thing is here is this: fashion is still going to exist on both sides of the house, right? Look at the example opening opposition used. He said, I want to wear a kurta because it makes me feel confident. But the point is, you still do have local manufacturers that are still going to be manufacturing these clothes, right? So it's not like all your fashion is going to disappear. Maybe now as a consumer, I only buy 2 shirts a year, or I have the choice of buying 2 shirts a year versus 5 or 10 shirts a year. We think you need to weigh that up versus all of the harms that we give you on this side of the house. So it's unclear why this access to so much fashion is incredibly important. But even if it is, we tell you this is more important. What was the final point of response we got from closing opposition? The final thing they said was that now you have brandless alternatives, and now essentially you're going to go even more underground with these alternatives. A few points of response here, right? Firstly, they said that it's important for H&M to continue using sweatshops because that's when you get publicity and that's when you get lobbying for change. So essentially, you want them to keep abusing workers because that somehow is going to get you change in the future, right? We think that is absolutely ridiculous, as opposed to boycotting them and ensuring that they at least tend to move out of sweatshops. We think that's far more direct. But secondly, on brandless alternatives, we think brandless alternatives don't use the same sweatshops, right? They don't have the same distribution networks to go to Bangladesh. So it's likely to be a brandless alternative in a first world country. We think that comparative is far better because they're more regulated. You have things like labor standards as opposed to using sweatshops on our side of the house. So we don't think brandless alternatives stands on that side of the debate. So then why are sweatshops so uniquely bad, given that we're willing to trade this right to fashion off because you still have some clothes, even if it's lesser clothes, versus using sweatshops, say? Firstly, Karan tells you that there's often very, very aggressive marketing, like we've said in extension, right? The reason you go to sweatshops is because you need that high demand and high turnover, and that's why you go to sweatshops to begin with. A few things on regulation and sweatshops and providing jobs to these individuals, right? Because this has been contested that sweatshops are good in these developing countries. We give you 2 things that opening government missed. We say, firstly, often these sweatshops aren't regulated because it's a race to the bottom, right? So you tell Bangladesh that we are just going to move our sweatshop to Taiwan if you don't let us set up our sweatshop here and impose the standards that we want. We think that's incredibly damaging to these developing countries at the extent to which you're providing them so many jobs. And that's why it's so incredibly difficult to impose any sort of standards or improvement. So to the extent you're saying that you have some sort of sustainable development model, that model looks like sending a few kids to school or giving a bit of higher extra pay to a few people while still having them work the rest of the day, right? So we think all of this change is incredibly tokenistic. It's never actually visible to people. But secondly, we think that governments within these countries are often politically motivated to accept the kinds of sweatshops that H&M gives them because it's an easy way to provide jobs to your people, right? So we don't think that holds. I'll take opening.
Why should I not spend my hard-earned money on being the coolest kid in town as H&M tells me I will be, and instead care about the kids in Bangladesh?
Because being the coolest kids in town means that you're affecting several poor people in Bangladesh. It's fine if you're not the coolest kid in town, you're just a cool kid in town with 2 shirts as opposed to 5 versus all of the harms that we've provided you on that side of the house. But secondly, we told you that often these jobs are just prone to automation, right? If your point is that you want fashion to be incredibly accessible and incredibly cheap to people, it means companies can just automate that job if it means you provide, you can manufacture that clothes for cheaper and provide more access to fashion. So it's unclear why these jobs are ever going to be sustainable in the long run. Why is a boycott effective? And here's where opening government missed out again. We say, firstly, at the very least, if it means that you no longer have to go to Bangladesh to manufacture that many clothes, it means that, say, politicians in these countries at least now have some incentive to start giving other jobs to these people as opposed to taking the easy option of setting up a sweatshop because it's easy for H&M to do so. We think that's incredibly important. But secondly, it also means that things like local industries can come up as a result of this, right? When the demand for these clothes goes down and you no longer have to go to Bangladesh because you need to manufacture clothes that are higher in quality because individuals are buying less, it means that Bangladesh now has at least some incentives for local industries to come up. And if these companies were so benevolent as they say, it's likely that they're going to now redistribute this wealth as opposed to continue to oppress these workers. We think this debate is about a trade-off. We would much rather trade off an individual to be less cool if it means that the working conditions in these areas are improved. We're very proud to propose.
All right, so the problem with literally everyone except Cheryl in this room is that they do not realize what makes people act regardless of what kind of obligations they have. Because everyone is going to have multiple completing obligations that are moral to oneself and their surroundings. And we believe on closing opposition that your obligations to yourself, that your obligations to your family, to you securing a better job when you're a lower middle class consumer is more important than those people that you're presumably going to be saving, even though we argued that you won't, in those developing countries that they talk about. The problem with GovBench is that they didn't talk about those comparative obligations. The problem with CG is that they give you literally the same reason for having a moral obligation, which is caring about the workers, and then not actually even talking about why you should care about the rest of the analysis of how this is going to matter because of automation and everything. Those kinds of things do not matter for the first world consumer. What matters for the first world consumer is either my obligation is very high to save those people, and it's enough for me, and it's good enough for me to lose out all the options that I get by buying that fashion. That is very problematic. 2 things in my speech. Who am I, the actor, and what are my choices and options? And then who are they, the producers and the industries that we're talking about? That is not fashion. It's still firstly retail. So let's talk about the first point, who I am, the actor. So 2 things in opening half that were correct. When OO comes up and says that this is important for self-actualization, and when OG comes up and says that basically these consumers are the only ones that can change the status quo and how these companies behave. We believe that that is a correct thing to say to a degree. But what else did we give you in Cheryl's speech? We gave you reasons for why that self-actualization is meaningful, and it's not fair for Daniel to come up here and strawman that, saying that like, oh, you just simply want to get the coolest person on the block and you don't want your friends who are probably assholes to leave you, right? That's not the comparative, and that's not the trade-off that you're making.
The trade-off is that if you're lower middle class, you can't buy the first blazer that you've never owned before from a nice shop at Zara, and probably can't compete as well with other higher middle class people or upper class people in your job interviews, because that is something that is very important. Exactly in this instance, when you actually are making this comparative, your obligation to yourself to securing that job, or your obligation to your family to securing that job, for example, is way more important in the context of when you can save some people in Bangladesh. You've never actually proven to me why that obligation is less important. Obviously, it probably doesn't seem very palatable that you make those people suffer for you, but as a person who cares about themselves, like largely always more than anyone else, firstly, and secondly, as a person of diminished privilege in those first world countries, it is important given this context to realize that you have a lesser of a degree of a moral obligation to care about others when literally in the short term, you're losing too much and you're not gaining anything in this process. So that is something that we brought to in Cheryl's speech. That is something that they've never talked about. Comparative moral obligations and how you choose what kind of options you take given those moral obligations. We totally win on this point. But like, okay, basically CG comes up and says, no, that's not the comparative. The comparative is just buying less clothes because of aggressive marketing. So two things here. Aggressive marketing actually comes from brands like Louis Vuitton, Rolex, and stuff like that. That's why you go to Zara, because you've seen the ads for Louis Vuitton, and then you want to buy something that looks similar, but is cheaper because you're too poor to afford those nice options that make you feel good about yourself, that make you feel that you actually don't look fat, that make you feel that you have options, and that make you feel you can perform comfortably in situations where you are competing with people of higher privilege. That is the problem here, because that marketing will exist, and if that is true, then their argument helps us, because that will make you feel even more worse. That will make you feel that you are not as good as others because that marketing still exists. The idea that you need to buy these clothes in the first place is there. Therefore, if they're correct in their argumentation, it becomes worse. But we think to a degree that's not true, because aggressive marketing is going to simply exist to the same degree, or is going to shift to other people. This is my second point. Who are these companies and who are they going to target instead? Something that Cheryl gave you in her extension. So like, note, this is not just about fashion. The exchange that we heard about fashion in the opening house was largely uninteresting because it didn't actually impact the person who is part of the motion, the person who is making the decisions. What's important, presumably, if we believe that they care about those people in those bad working conditions, is that if you care about those people, then your choice to boycott has to sit down, help them more than actually damage them. And we believe it's problematic on GovBench to suggest that these companies have static options of not exploiting and exploiting. Probably not true, right? There's going to be many more options, because as you lose your customer base that is lower middle class, the only people that you can target are lower class people in those societies. That means you have to cut your profit margins. That means you have to cut your support for those workers, because these are the only people who are going to buy. Why are they definitely going to buy? For the same reasons we gave you in our extension in the first place. They're of lower privilege. They cannot care about those people. They're probably less educated than the current people who are buying these clothes. Therefore, they will buy these clothes more, and it will harm those workers, because who's going to suffer? You're not going to buy helmets for them. You're not going to buy healthcare for them in those places. I'll take CG.
Okay, your argument only applies to a subsection of the population who make a very specific choice of a blazer, as opposed to the multiple different purchasing choices, all of which harm people in developing countries.
Right. So like, we believe that the majority of the customer base, like, it's your problem you didn't characterize the buyers, right? The buyers are people who wouldn't afford those more expensive clothing. Because if they did afford those more expensive clothing, they would buy them because they afford you a higher position in society. These are the majority of the customers that buy. They're people like you and I, or they're people who are even less rich, but need that one bag of clothing, not 9 a season, right? So like, those are the customers that we're talking about that form the majority of this debate. But what happens to those companies if not moving to lower class people as customer base? They move to other countries, which is Zara already doing by moving into Pakistan, as retail centers. So if OG comes up to us and says that these first world people are more likely to care about these issues because by definition of their, like by virtue of their privilege and education, then probably if you move into other countries where people think that is something less urgent, when people crave that social capital a lot more, they're going to care less. There's probably going to be more sweatshops in that instance. There's probably going to be less caring about the environment because these people don't care about that as much. But problematically, these brands are brands. They have a reputation. That's why they do corporate social responsibility. Those brands that are no names, that you don't know where they put their money into, that have to be cheaper because you have to afford them by definition in this debate, are probably going to be more exploitative. Or if not, then they're probably going to be more expensive, therefore unaffordable to the people that we care about in this debate. Because we actually showed you what the actor thinks, what they are, we believe we take this debate.